The air inside the temple of Jupiter smelled of smoke and wet marble. The morning sun cut through the bronze gates, glinting on the ceremonial knife that no one dared to touch. In the center of the floor, a man knelt. His name was Marcus Atilius Regulus, Rome's Flamen Dialis, high priest of Jupiter, the most sacred position a mortal could hold. He had spent 20 years serving the gods. Today, those same gods had abandoned him. His white robe, once a symbol of divine purity, had been torn and restitched with black thread, a mark of contamination. His hands were bound with linen, not chains. His mouth sealed with a strip of lambskin soaked in salt water. The city's priests surrounded him in silence. Behind them stood the Pontifex Maximus, the supreme overseer of religion, a man who looked more like a senator than a servant of the divine. They weren't here to kill Marcus, they were here to erase him. In Rome, there were punishments worse than death. Execution was final, swift, almost merciful. But disgrace was eternal. A citizen could be killed once. A priest could be unmade forever. Marcus had committed no crime of blood or theft. He had broken something far more dangerous: ritual perfection. During the feast of Jupiter, the most sacred festival of the Roman year, he had interrupted the ceremony to help a wounded slave who had collapsed near the altar. It was a small act of mercy, but mercy had no place in ritual. By touching the slave, Marcus had polluted the offering. By stopping the chant, he had broken the covenant between Rome and its god. And when that covenant broke, it was said that Jupiter himself turned his face from the city. The Senate met within hours. To fail the gods was to fail Rome, and Rome punished failure with ceremony. They stripped Marcus of his title, his robes, his authority, but they would not execute him. His blood, they said, would only anger the heavens further. Instead, they would purify him through silence. The decree was written plainly: the priest shall live, but speak no more. He shall breathe, but lead no rites. He shall remain among men, but belong to none. To Rome, this was justice. To Marcus, it was damnation. Outside the temple, the city went on as if nothing had changed. Chariots rolled through the forum. Merchants called out prices. Soldiers laughed in the shade. No one mentioned his name aloud. It was as if the man had never existed. And yet, every priest who passed the temple of Jupiter that morning glanced toward its gates, reminded that Rome did not forgive imperfection, even in its servants of the divine. The punishment of Marcus Regulus was not about one man. It was a message to all who served. The gods belonged to Rome, and Rome alone decided what pleased them. The paradox of Rome was simple. It worshipped gods, but feared chaos more. Faith was tolerated only as long as it obeyed the state. To control the gods, Rome controlled their priests. Every ritual, every prayer, every sacrifice was an act of politics disguised as worship. The priesthood was not a calling, it was a contract. The empire did not need holiness, it needed precision. One wrong word in a prayer, one hesitation in a ritual, and the entire ceremony could be declared invalid, as though the empire's divine protection had expired. Marcus Regulus's act of compassion had been, in Rome's eyes, an act of rebellion. He had placed humanity above ritual, conscience above obedience, and for that, he was considered more dangerous than a traitor. As the sun set, the temple's doors were sealed. Marcus was left inside with a jug of water, a loaf of barley bread, and his silence. He would not be executed. He would live out his days in isolation, forbidden to see his family, forbidden to pray, forbidden even to die by his own hand. Rome had mastered the art of spiritual torture. It didn't need to spill blood to destroy a man. It only needed to take away his purpose. They didn't kill him. They made him disappear while he was still alive. And in doing so, Rome proved a truth that echoed through all its centuries, that control over faith was the purest form of power. Rome was not a godless empire. It was an empire that owned its gods. Every ritual, every prayer, every gesture toward the divine was recorded, supervised, and approved by the state. Religion in Rome was never about faith, it was about function. The gods were partners in an eternal contract. If Rome kept the rituals, the gods would keep the empire. But any mistake, any impurity, any deviation risked breaking that agreement. That was why the priesthood was bound by rules so rigid, so suffocating, that even breathing wrong during a ceremony could be considered sacrilege. The Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter, was forbidden from touching metal, forbidden from riding a horse, forbidden from seeing an army, forbidden from sleeping outside his home, and forbidden from looking upon the dead. He was to live as a man separated from the world, pure, untouched, a vessel through which the empire communicated with the divine. But what Rome called purity was closer to imprisonment. The priest's life belonged to the state. His every motion, every hour, every word was watched. He could not resign, could not travel, could not change. Even his wife was chosen for him, because the gods demanded it. And if he failed in any of these duties, he was not just a sinner, he was a danger to Rome itself. The Roman historian Livy wrote that a single failed ritual could bring ruin to a nation, and in a way, he was right. For a city that saw divine favor as its shield, imperfection was the crack through which disaster could enter. That fear built an empire obsessed with perfection, not the perfection of morality or kindness, but the perfection of order. The priest who faltered became the scapegoat for cosmic imbalance. If the harvest failed, it was his fault. If lightning struck the capital, it was his impurity. If enemies invaded, it was his failure to please Jupiter. And so, when Marcus Regulus stopped the ritual to help a dying slave, it wasn't mercy the Romans saw. It was chaos wearing compassion's mask. Rome's obsession with control ran deeper than politics. It was a form of religion itself, the worship of certainty. Every empire fears rebellion, but Rome feared unpredictability more than rebellion. To maintain its illusion of divine order, it needed human perfection, and that meant its priests could never falter. To protect the empire from error, the state created a bureaucracy of holiness, a vast system known as the Collegium Pontificum. These were not monks or mystics, they were administrators in robes. They kept records of omens, approved sacrifices, audited temples, and punished those who performed rites incorrectly. The pontiffs were, in essence, religious accountants, balancing the spiritual ledgers of the empire. They did not measure devotion, they measured compliance. When a priest like Marcus Regulus stepped out of line, he was not judged by divine revelation, he was judged by procedure, and procedure had no mercy. This is what made Roman religion so paradoxical. It demanded absolute faith, but it never trusted its own believers. The gods were mighty, but only as long as Rome managed them. The priests were holy, but only as long as they obeyed Rome's script. The result was a kind of perfection that could not survive reality. No human could maintain such purity indefinitely. Every priest was destined to fail, and every failure became proof that the empire still needed punishment, still needed control. In the end, the system was self-sustaining. Each disgraced priest reaffirmed the need for Rome's oversight. Each humiliation strengthened the myth that only through order could chaos be defeated. That is why Marcus Regulus's silence was not an accident, it was policy. By silencing him, Rome proved that it alone could speak for the gods. His silence became the empire's voice. Centuries later, historians would look back and marvel at Rome's engineering, its bridges, its roads, its aqueducts. But Rome's greatest construction wasn't made of stone. It was the invisible architecture of obedience. An empire that could command the heavens, could command anything beneath them, and the high priest of Jupiter, the man who once stood between gods and mortals, became nothing more than a warning carved into history. Serve the gods, but serve Rome first. The punishment of Marcus Regulus didn't end in the temple, it began there. After the council stripped him of his title and his voice, the guards escorted him through the streets of Rome in absolute silence. There were no shackles, no iron chains, just soft linen binding his wrists, a symbolic, almost gentle, form of humiliation. He walked past the bustling forum, where the usual noise of the city seemed to die around him. Citizens, once eager to catch his eye or receive a blessing, now turned their heads away. Some pretended not to see him at all. Others instinctively made an ancient sign to ward off bad fortune, a reflex against contamination. No one dared to speak his name. In Rome, to even acknowledge the disgraced was to invite the same fate. It was said that the anger of Jupiter clung to them like smoke. He wasn't taken to a prison. His destination was his own home, a grand priestly residence that had now become a gilded cage. A single guard was posted at his door, but not to keep him in. The guard was there to keep everyone else out. The Romans had a term for this: ritual containment. He was still, technically, the Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter, but he was forbidden from performing any rites. Forbidden to touch the sacred altar. Forbidden, most cruelly, to ever step inside his temple again. His voice, which was once essential for the most powerful invocations to Jupiter, was now forbidden to even speak the god's name. He lived surrounded by the sacred tools of his trade, relics he could no longer use, in a world that no longer had a place for him. Days bled into weeks, and weeks blurred into a state of ritual emptiness. Without the ceremonies to perform, without the hymns to chant, Marcus lost his purpose. You see, a priest without worship is just a man of faith who's been sidelined. He becomes a ghost of duty, a living shadow. The Romans understood this with a terrifying clarity. They had engineered a punishment designed not to destroy the body, but to erase the soul, to turn a revered priest into a walking absence, a living, breathing reminder of what happens when the divine order is interrupted. Every morning, a scribe would visit. His job was simple: to record that Marcus still lived. Each entry in the official log ended with the same cold, detached phrase: "He remains in silence. The order is preserved." Inside his home, the walls were adorned with magnificent frescoes of the gods Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, painted in vibrant pigments that had, over time, begun to fade. He would sit beneath them for hours, watching the colors slowly die, as if mirroring the slow decay of his own spirit. It was said that he once whispered to a servant, "The gods have color. Rome paints them gray." The servant was dismissed the very next day. No one ever dared to repeat those words again. Once a year, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief high priest, sent an official to inspect him. The visit was purely ceremonial, a box to be ticked. The official would ask no questions, only observe. Marcus, in turn, would offer a silent, obedient bow. By the 6th year of his confinement, he had not spoken a single word. To the empire, he was a resounding success, living proof that their system of control worked perfectly. A broken man, they reasoned, was far safer than a martyred one. Rumors swirled through the city. Some said he had gone mad from the isolation. Others believed his profound silence was a new, deeper form of prayer. But when the world refuses to listen, madness and prayer can often look like the same thing. One evening, a violent storm swept across Rome. Lightning, jagged and brilliant, struck the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The roof caught fire. Panic spread through the streets like the flames themselves. People whispered that Jupiter was angry again, that the sacrilege which had led to Marcus's punishment was still festering. That night, a frantic messenger arrived at Marcus's house. He carried an urgent question from the Senate. What should we do? Marcus just stared at him, his face a mask of indifference. The messenger, trembling, asked again, "How do we restore the gods' favor?" For the first time in years, Marcus raised his head. And though he was forbidden to speak, the words finally escaped him, quiet, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. "Listen, do nothing. Let him burn." The messenger fled in terror. By dawn, soldiers had arrived. The fire was extinguished, but the priest's fate was sealed. The official record would later state, the high priest spoke against the gods. The gods spared him not. He was found the next morning, sitting before the smoldering ashes of the temple, his white robe soaked through with rain. He was alive, but completely unmoving, a statue of grief. The council declared him ritually dead. His name was struck from all priestly lists, his home was sealed shut, and his body still breathing was left to disappear from history. They called it damnatio sacerdotis the condemnation of the priest. It was an execution, it was an exile, it was something colder, more complete. To Rome, this was justice perfected. The empire had defeated a perceived rebellion without spilling a drop of blood. It had made a man vanish not by the sword, but by silence. Years later, his house was torn down to build new apartments for minor officials. During the demolition, workers found a small wax tablet buried beneath the floorboards. On it was carved a single, defiant line: "If silence is purity, may the gods hear nothing at all." No one dared to keep it. The tablet was immediately burned, but someone, somewhere, remembered the words, and memory, as it always does, outlived the empire. Rome recorded Marcus Regulus as a failure, a cautionary tale, but in truth, he was proof of something the empire never wanted to admit, that even in absolute silence, resistance can find a way to echo through time. Because Rome didn't crucify its priests, it sanctified their suffering. And by calling its cruelty purification, it convinced the world, and itself, that its control was divine. Rome was built on purity, not moral purity, but ritual purity. To remain in favor with the gods, the empire needed its priests to be flawless. Not compassionate, not wise, just flawless. Perfection was not about goodness, it was about control. The idea was simple and terrifying. If the empire was divine, then every imperfection within it was a threat to heaven itself, and every impurity, a sick slave, a failed ritual, a trembling hand, had to be contained, silenced, erased. Purity became the empire's obsession, its weapon, and finally, its addiction. The Collegium Pontificum, the body that governed Rome's religion, functioned like a court of sanctity. Its members did not pray, they legislated faith. They decided who was clean enough to serve the gods, and who had polluted the sacred order by being too human. For Rome, purity was never spiritual, it was administrative. A priest was either pure or impure, compliant or defiant. There was no in-between. And that is what made the system so powerful. The moment perfection became law, forgiveness became impossible. Marcus Regulus's downfall was not unique. He was part of a long line of sacred casualties, priests, virgins, and others who dared to fail. The Vestal Virgins, for instance, were the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, keeper of Rome's eternal flame. Their vow was absolute chastity, and their purity was said to protect the entire city. But when one was accused of breaking that vow, the punishment was not execution. It was something colder, more deliberate, more Roman. She would be led through the forum in silence, veiled in white, escorted by a procession of priests. At the edge of the city, a small underground chamber awaited her. Inside were a lamp, a loaf of bread, a small jug of water. Then the entrance was sealed with earth. She was left alive, but beyond reach of the living. Her death was ritual, slow and sacred. The people were told that the gods demanded purity, but what the gods demanded was obedience. That was the genius of Rome's system. It never killed out of rage, it killed through procedure. Every act of cruelty was disguised as law, every humiliation dressed in the garments of holiness. When the empire buried its priestesses alive or silenced its priests, it told the world that these were not punishments, they were offerings. And Rome believed that through sacrifice, order was restored. The politics of purity went beyond temples. It reached into families, courts, and even the Senate itself. A senator accused of greed could purify himself through public shame. A general who lost a battle could redeem honor through self-sacrifice. Even the emperor, if he failed to appease the gods, could cleanse his image by condemning others as impure. In this way, purity became the currency of power. Those who could define it ruled those who feared losing it. And fear of impurity, fear of disgrace, became the quiet heartbeat of Roman life. The empire had mastered the cycle, create rules so impossible to follow that failure was inevitable, declare failure as impurity. Purify through punishment, and call it divine order. It was a loop that kept the people obedient and the rulers untouchable. Because when purity is defined by authority, no one can ever be clean enough. When the great historian Tacitus wrote about the fall of corrupt emperors, he often noted how their cruelty hid behind the language of virtue. He said, "They called it purification, but it was vengeance in disguise," and so, century after century, the rituals continued, priests silenced, virgins buried, omens interpreted to justify slaughter. Every act of horror was sanctified through Latin prayer. Every injustice was washed clean with ceremony. Rome had turned faith into infrastructure, an invisible system that could justify anything. The story of Marcus Regulus was just one link in that chain. He was the proof that no man, no office, no god stood above the empire's need for control. The gods might rule the heavens, but Rome ruled their names, their temples, their worship, and even their silence. To the Romans, the destruction of a priest was not tragedy, it was maintenance, a necessary sacrifice to keep the machinery of the sacred running smoothly. And because every act of punishment was wrapped in the language of holiness, the people never saw tyranny. They saw purification. That was the brilliance of Rome. It didn't hide its cruelty. It rebranded it as virtue. The politics of purity created the illusion of eternal order. But in truth, it was a fragile illusion, an empire terrified of its own imperfection. And when you fear imperfection more than injustice, you become capable of anything. Rome's priests didn't die for their sins. They died for being human. When Marcus Regulus vanished from the records, Rome did not mourn him. The empire had no need for martyrs. It needed reminders, examples to keep the living obedient. The official inscription of his removal was brief, almost sterile. He failed the rite. The gods were appeased. No statue was broken. No grave was built. He simply ceased to exist, as though the gods had erased him with a single, divine breath. But silence, like ashes, never disappears. It only settles, waiting for someone to disturb it. The decades that followed his disappearance saw Rome reach the height of its glory. Armies victorious, temples gleaming, citizens convinced that divine order had been secured forever. But under the marble and the prayers, cracks began to spread. The more the empire demanded purity, the more corruption festered in its shadows. The priests who remained were no longer holy men. They were administrators, politicians, voices that repeated what the Senate wished the gods to say. Religion became bureaucracy, faith became performance, and silence became survival. Rome had learned a terrible lesson, and taught it to the world, that it was not truth that sustained an empire, but obedience disguised as virtue. That even the divine could be domesticated, that even faith could serve the state. The gods of Rome had once been wild, ancient forces of wind, fire, and sky. By the 1st century, they had been tamed into symbols of order. Every prayer was a transaction, every ritual, a contract, every priest, a civil servant. Marcus Regulus had broken that contract, not by betraying the gods, but by remembering what worship was supposed to mean. He had chosen compassion over perfection, and in doing so, he reminded Rome that its gods were no longer divine, they were administrative, and for that, he had to be erased. Centuries later, when the empire began to fall, when invasions tore through its borders and its temples turned to dust, people would look back and wonder how such a power could collapse. Some blamed the barbarians, some blamed new religions. But the truth is quieter, more uncomfortable. Rome fell because it forgot how to listen. It silenced not only its enemies, but also its conscience. Its priests stopped praying and started reciting. Its rituals became habit. Its faith became fear. And when a civilization worships fear, its gods stop listening. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover the ruins of the Temple of Jupiter. They found fragments of marble altars, inscriptions, and among them, a small piece of bronze bearing the name Regulus. The letters had been scratched out, but not deep enough. A trace remained, a ghost of a name that refused to die. Some scholars dismiss it as coincidence, others call it proof. Either way, Marcus Regulus's silence had survived longer than the empire that imposed it. Rome's treatment of its priests reveals something larger than history. It shows us what happens when devotion becomes administration, when faith becomes obedience, when morality bends to power. Every empire, ancient or modern, repeats this pattern in its own language. It rewards those who conform, and silences those who remind it of its own hypocrisy. Marcus was not the first to be erased from mercy, and he will not be the last. His story is not a tale of religion. It is a mirror of civilization itself. How easily virtue can be replaced by precision, how obedience can masquerade as faith, and how silence can outlive every empire that enforces it. Rome believed that by silencing one priest, it had preserved divine order, but what it truly preserved was fear, the kind that seeps into generations, teaching them that to stay pure, they must stay quiet. And so, when we speak of Rome's legacy, we should not only remember its roads and monuments, we should remember the silence it perfected, the silence that smothered compassion, that punished imperfection, that mistook obedience for faith. Because that silence did not end with Rome, it became the language of power itself. They didn't crucify him, they silenced him. They didn't erase his faith, they nationalized it. And in doing so, they taught the world that even the sacred could serve the state. That is what Rome did to its own priests, and that is why its gods eventually stopped listening. This was the depraved side of Roman justice, the one history never told you about.